I made a promise to a 12-year-old girl that I would keep her safe. And for 41 days I kept that promise. On the 42nd day, I broke it. Not because I stopped caring, and not because something took her from me, but because I made a decision that I believed was right, and the cost of that decision was her trust. She looked at me with the kind of betrayal that only a child can express, total, uncomprehending, as though I had reached into the architecture of her world and pulled out a load-bearing wall. I have thought about that look every day since. I think about it when I eat. I think about it when the sun goes down and the temperature drops and the stars come out in that dense, cold way they have at altitude, where the atmosphere is too thin to blur them into something gentle. I think about it when I do the things I must do to stay alive, the small rituals of wood and water and counting what remains. She forgave me eventually. Children do that. They lack the stamina for permanent grudges. Or maybe they simply understand, in some way adults have forgotten, that people fail each other, and the failing is not the end of everything. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration, and what I lost in her eyes that day was something I have never fully recovered, which was the belief that I was a man who could be trusted without qualification. I am telling this story because someone should know what happened on Stillwater Mountain during the weeks the world came apart. Not the whole world. I must be careful about language. From where I sat, 8,400 feet above sea level, with a sight line that reached 47 miles on a clear day, it certainly looked like the whole world. But I know now that it wasn't. There were other mountains, other towers, other people who sat in the quiet and watched the fires and made their own impossible choices. I can only speak for mine. My name is Thomas Alder, and for 11 years I was a fire lookout ranger for the United States Forest Service, stationed in the Cascade Range of Washington State. The tower on Stillwater Mountain was built in 1953, a 14 by 14-foot cab mounted on a 40-foot steel frame base, with windows on all four sides and an Osborne firefinder bolted to a pedestal in the center. The firefinder is a device that looks like a topographic map encased in a rotating sighting mechanism, and its purpose is simple. You see smoke, you align the crosshairs, you read the azimuth, and you radio the bearing to dispatch. If another lookout on another peak can give a second bearing, the intersection of those two lines tells the ground crews exactly where the fire is. Triangulation. The geometry of vigilance. I loved that work in a way that I have never loved anything else, and I say that with the full knowledge of what it reveals about me. I was not a man built for human closeness. I was built for observation, for patience, for the particular solitude of high places. My ex-wife, Karen, told me once that I related to the world the way a lighthouse relates to the sea. Useful, visible, but fundamentally apart. She was not wrong. We divorced in 2019, amicably, which is another way of saying we had so little left to fight over that even the lawyers seemed embarrassed. The season I am telling you about was my 11th on Stillwater. I hiked in on June 14th, which was a Thursday, carrying a 65-pound pack up 9 miles of switchback trail through old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. The last 2 miles crossed a boulder field above the tree line where the wind hit you sideways, and the only company was the pikas whistling from the scree. I arrived at the tower at 4:47 in the afternoon, winded but not unhappy, and spent the remaining daylight hours doing what I always did on the first day, inventorying supplies, testing the radio, cleaning the windows, and standing on the catwalk with a cup of instant coffee while the sun went down behind the Olympic Range, 112 miles to the west, visible as a dark serrated line against the orange. I had food for 90 days, which was the standard cache. Canned goods, rice, dried beans, powdered milk, coffee, oatmeal, a case of energy bars, vitamins, and a luxury ration of dark chocolate that I allowed myself 1 square of per night. I had 48 gallons of water in jerry cans, supplemented by a spring 200 yards down the east slope that ran reliably until late August. I had a solar panel and a battery bank for the radio and weather instruments. I had a propane stove with 4 canisters. I had a medical kit, a toolbox, binoculars, a spotting scope, 2 flashlights, a headlamp, spare batteries, a fire extinguisher, a .30-06 rifle for bears, 40 rounds of ammunition, a paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that I brought every year and never finished, and a framed photograph of my mother that I hung on the same nail by the door. That was my world. 14 by 14 feet of it, plus the catwalk, plus everything I could see from it, which on a clear day was roughly 7,000 square miles of forest, ridge, river, and sky. The first 3 weeks were unremarkable. Fire season was late that year. The snowpack had been heavy, and the forest was still damp, exhaling fog into the valleys each morning that didn't burn off until 10 or 11. I logged my weather observations every hour from 0600 to 2100. Temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, visibility. I called the readings in to the Darrington dispatch office twice daily, at 0900 and 1700. The dispatcher was a woman named Linda Price, who had been doing the job for 22 years and had the calm, flattened affect of a person who has heard every kind of panic and knows that the correct response to all of them is to slow down and get the coordinates right. I liked Linda. Our conversations were brief, professional, and comforting in their sameness. Stillwater, this is Darrington. Go ahead. Darrington, Stillwater. Morning obs. Temperature 58. Humidity 72%. Wind southwest at 6. Visibility 31 miles. Cloud cover broken at 8,000. No smoke observed. Copy, Stillwater. Enjoy the quiet. Will do, Darrington. Stillwater clear. That was the shape of it. Routine, repetition. The discipline of recording what you see. I find it difficult to explain why this life suited me so completely, without sounding like I'm romanticizing isolation, which I'm not. Isolation can break a person. I've seen it happen. There was a lookout 2 ridges over, a young man on his first season at Miners Ridge who started talking to himself on the radio in week 5 and had to be evacuated. The solitude is not for everyone, and it is not always good for anyone. But I had learned, over the years, to fill the silence with structure rather than with dread. I woke at 05:30. I made coffee. I stepped out onto the catwalk and read the sky the way a sailor reads the sea. Not for beauty, though there was beauty, but for information. The tilt of the clouds told me about the pressure gradient. The color of the light told me about the moisture content. The behavior of the wind against the treetops 2,000 feet below told me whether conditions were stable or whether the atmosphere was mixing, pulling dry air down from the upper levels. The kind of mixing that turns a smoldering stump into a crown fire in 90 minutes. I was, in the most literal sense, a man who watched the world for a living. I did not know that this skill, this habit of observation, would become the thing that kept me alive. The first sign that something was wrong came on July 8th at approximately 22:30. I was lying in my cot, reading by headlamp, when I heard a faint sound that I initially took for distant thunder. I got up and stepped onto the catwalk. The sky was clear, a deep black salted with stars, and there was no lightning visible in any quadrant. But to the south-southeast, maybe 35 miles away, in the direction of the town of Darrington, I could see a glow on the horizon. It was too concentrated and too orange for wildfire, and it was in the wrong place. In the valley, where the town sat along the Sauk River, not on the ridgelines where fires typically started. I watched it for 40 minutes. The glow intensified, then diminished, then intensified again in a different spot, as though it were moving. I made a note in my logbook. 22:30. Anomalous light source observed bearing 168 degrees. Estimate distance 34 miles. Consistent with structure fire in or near Darrington. No smoke column visible due to darkness. Will report at morning OBS. At 0600 the next morning, I trained the spotting scope on the Darrington Valley. Visibility was decent, 26 miles, but at that distance the town was a smudge, a pattern of tiny geometries against the green. I could see no active smoke. I called it in at 0900. Linda answered as she always did, but there was something in her voice that I noticed only in retrospect. A tightness, a half-second delay before she spoke, as though she were choosing her words with unusual care. Copy, Stillwater. We're aware of some activity in the area. Maintain your normal schedule. We'll advise if anything changes. I acknowledged and signed off, and I did not think much more about it that day. Fires in towns were not my jurisdiction. I watched for forest fires. The division of labor was clear, and I trusted the system. The system held for 3 more days. On July 10th, I noticed increased air traffic. Military helicopters, Chinooks and Blackhawks, flying south at low altitude. 4 groups of 3 over the course of the afternoon, their rotors cutting the air with that heavy concussive sound that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. They were not following the usual flight paths for wildfire suppression. They were heading toward the population centers, toward Everett and Marysville and the I-5 corridor. I logged each flight with the time and bearing and number of aircraft. At 1700, when I called in my evening obs, Linda did not answer. Instead, I got a man whose voice I didn't recognize, younger, speaking quickly. Stillwater, this is Darrington Actual. We're on limited operations. Submit your obs. I gave him the numbers. He copied them, and the channel went dead without the usual pleasantries. I sat with the handset in my lap for a long time after that. On July 11th, at 1340, I saw the first column of smoke that I knew was not a forest fire. It rose from the direction of Arlington, 52 miles to the south-southwest. A heavy, black, petroleum-fed column that leaned eastward in the upper-level wind. An hour later, a second column appeared, this one from the direction of Marysville, closer to the coast. By evening, there were 5 visible columns along the I-5 corridor, and the southern horizon had taken on a brownish-yellow haze that dimmed the sun as it went down. I tried to raise Darrington Dispatch at 1700 and got nothing. I tried again at 1730, 1800, and 1830. Nothing. I switched to the Forest Service emergency frequency and called for any station. Nothing. I tried the county sheriff's frequency. Nothing. I tried the state emergency management frequency and heard for the first time a recorded message that was cycling on a loop. This is an emergency broadcast from the Washington State Emergency Management Division. A public health emergency has been declared for all counties west of the Cascade Range. Residents are advised to shelter in place. Do not travel unless directed by authorities. Hospitals are at capacity. If you are in a secure location, remain there. This message will repeat. I listened to it 3 times. Then I turned off the radio to save the battery and stood on the catwalk and watched the smoke columns multiply in the fading light. And I understood, in the way that you understand a diagnosis you've suspected for weeks, that the world down there was falling apart. I should explain what I knew and when I knew it. The answer is almost nothing, almost too late. I had no internet at the tower. I had no cell service. My only link to the outside was the Forest Service radio network, a handful of preset frequencies, and whatever I could see with my eyes and my scope. In the days that followed, I pieced together fragments from the radio. Partial transmissions, panicked voices, the professional calm of military operators issuing orders I could barely hear through the static. The word outbreak appeared early and often. So did quarantine, perimeter, evacuate, and eventually overrun. I heard a National Guard officer on a tactical frequency say very clearly, "We have lost containment in Skagit County. All units fall back to the bridge at Cedro-Woolley." I heard a woman on a civilian frequency say, "They're in the hospital. They got into the hospital through the loading dock." I heard a child crying on an open channel for 11 minutes before someone, or something, cut the transmission. I did not hear anyone say the word zombie. That word belongs to movies and television, to a genre I had never had much patience for. What I heard people say in the early days was infected. Later they said them or those things, or simply went quiet in the middle of sentences in ways that left me gripping the radio with both hands. From the tower, here is what I saw. The fires spread. Not wildfire. I knew wildfire, knew its rhythms and its logic, the way it ran uphill and lay down at night when the humidity rose. These fires were structural, urban, and they burned without pattern. Towns that had been visible as clusters of reflected light at night went dark, one by one, over the course of a week. Darrington went dark on July 14th. Concrete went dark on July 15th. I could see the lights of Cedro-Woolley, 48 miles to the west-northwest, and they held on until July 18th, when they flickered twice and then vanished as though someone had pulled a breaker. The only lights that remained were the fires themselves, scattered across the valleys like the embers of a campfire that no one was tending. During the day, the smoke reduced my visibility to 15 miles, then 12, then 8. The air quality deteriorated. I tied a bandana over my face when I went out on the catwalk, and even so, my eyes burned and my throat went raw. The sunsets were extraordinary, deep crimsons and violets that I would have found beautiful in another context, but that I understood were the result of particulate matter from burning cities filtering the light. I recorded all of it. Azimuths, distances, timestamps. I filled 3 pages of my logbook every day. I don't know why. Habit, perhaps. Or the belief, which I still hold, that bearing witness is a form of duty. By July 16th, I had accepted that no one was coming to relieve me, and that the infrastructure I had depended on, the dispatch office, the resupply schedule, the helicopter that would fly me out in September, was gone. I took stock of my supplies with the seriousness that this realization demanded. I had food for approximately 72 days if I maintained my normal intake of roughly 2,000 calories per day. If I cut to 1,500, I could stretch it to 96 days. If I cut to 1,200, a level that would leave me functional but slowly weakening, I could make it 120 days, which would take me to mid-November, well into the first snows. Water was less of a concern as long as the spring held out, but I would need to carry it more frequently, since I was now reluctant to leave the tower for extended periods. The propane would last perhaps 60 days if I cooked only once per day and used no heat, which was manageable through the summer, but would become a problem by October. The solar panel kept the battery bank charged for the radio and the weather instruments, but the panel's output dropped in cloudy weather, and the smoke was already reducing the sunlight. I calculated that I could maintain 8 hours of radio monitoring per day indefinitely, or 16 hours per day for about 40 days before the batteries degraded beyond useful charge. I chose 8 hours. I needed to sleep. And in those early days, sleep was the only place where the world still made sense. I established a routine, because routine is what keeps a mind from unraveling when the inputs it receives are incomprehensible. I woke at 05:30. I made coffee, 1 tablespoon of instant crystals in 8 ounces of water, heated on the propane stove for exactly 90 seconds. I stepped onto the catwalk and performed a full 360-degree visual scan, noting any new smoke columns, changes in existing ones, and the position and movement of any visible fire. I recorded the weather observations, even though there was no one to report them to. I ate breakfast, a 1/4 cup of oatmeal with a tablespoon of powdered milk, and then I turned on the radio and began scanning frequencies, starting with the Forest Service channels and working outward through law enforcement, military, civilian, and amateur bands. I kept a log of every transmission I heard, noting the time, frequency, content, and signal strength. Most of what I heard was fragmentary and grim. But I listened, because listening was my job. And my job was the last thread connecting me to the person I had been before the world caught fire. On the morning of July 19th, 5 days after Darrington went dark, I was performing my sunrise scan when I noticed movement on the trail below. The trail to Stillwater Tower approaches from the southeast, climbing through dense forest for 7 miles before breaking above the tree line at around 6,800 feet. From the tower, I could see the last 1.5 miles of the trail, where it crossed the boulder field and the alpine meadow. Through the binoculars, I could see a figure moving slowly up the switchbacks, small and dark against the gray rock, stopping frequently. My first reaction was not relief. It was fear. In the days since the emergency broadcast, I had begun to think of the mountain as a fortress, and the trail as the only breach in its walls. I did not know what was coming up that trail. I did not know if whatever was happening in the valleys could climb. I picked up the rifle. I checked that it was loaded. I went out onto the catwalk and braced my elbows on the railing and watched through the binoculars as the figure worked its way up the last 1/4 mile. It moved with the stumbling, exhausted gait of a person who has been walking for a very long time. And as it drew closer, I could make out details. A small frame, a backpack that was far too large for the body carrying it, a red baseball cap. It was a child. I set the rifle against the wall and went down the stairs and walked out to meet her on the trail. She was sitting on a rock when I reached her, about 200 yards from the base of the tower. She had taken off the backpack and was hunched over with her forearms on her knees, breathing in the thin, high-altitude air with the ragged effort of someone whose lungs were not accustomed to it. She was small and brown-haired, and so filthy that it took me a moment to realize she was sunburned beneath the dirt. She was wearing hiking boots that were 2 sizes too large, jeans torn at both knees, and a fleece jacket that she had tied around her waist. The red cap said, "Cascades Volleyball," on the front. She looked up at me and said nothing. Her eyes were the dark, empty eyes of a person who has seen something that has rearranged the furniture of their understanding. And I recognized the look because I had seen it once before, in the face of a hiker I'd helped rescue after he spent 3 nights lost in the backcountry during a storm. It was the look of someone who has been alone with fear for so long that the sudden appearance of another person does not compute. I knelt down so that I was at her level. I said, "My name is Tom. I'm a ranger. You're safe here." These were lies, or at best aspirations, but they were the right words, and I said them in the calm, measured tone that 11 years of rescue coordination had drilled into me. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "My dad told me to follow the trail markers. He said there would be someone at the top." Her name was June. She was 12 years old. She had been hiking with her father, a man named David Chen, on the Pacific Crest Trail when the outbreak reached the mountain towns. They had been at a trailhead near Suiattle River, about 23 miles southeast of my tower, when they heard gunshots and saw vehicles racing down the forest roads. Her father had a map. He had seen the fire lookout marked on it, and he had told June to follow the trail to the tower while he went back to the truck for their supplies. That was 5 days ago. He told her he would be right behind her. She had walked for 5 days, alone, sleeping in trail shelters and under trees, eating the granola bars and dried fruit from her day pack, drinking from streams, following the blazes and cairns with the focus of a child who has been given a task by her father and intends to complete it. She did not cry when she told me this. She told it with the flat precision of a debriefing, and I understood that she had been rehearsing it in her head for 5 days, shaping the narrative into something she could carry. Children are stronger than we give them credit for. They are also more fragile, and the strength and the fragility exist in the same breath, which is what makes them so terrifying to be responsible for. I brought her up to the tower. I gave her water, small sips, not too fast, the way you hydrate someone who has been exerting themselves at altitude. I heated a can of chicken soup on the stove and watched her eat it with the careful, trembling hands of a person who is afraid the food is a hallucination that will evaporate if she moves too quickly. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cot and told her to rest. She was asleep in less than 2 minutes. I sat in the chair by the fire finder and watched her breathe and did the math in my head. 2 people instead of 1. My 72-day food supply had just become a 48-day food supply, assuming I fed her the same ration I fed myself, which I would not do. She was a growing child, she needed more, which meant the real number was closer to 40 days. 40 days. The arithmetic of survival is merciless. It does not care about compassion. It does not adjust for the fact that the person you are feeding is 12 years old and has been walking alone through a world that is eating itself. It simply divides what you have by the number of mouths and gives you a date. I recalculated everything that afternoon while June slept. 1,500 calories per day for me, 1,800 for her. She was active, she was young, she needed the fuel for her brain as much as her body. That gave us a combined requirement of 3,300 calories per day. My remaining supplies held approximately 216,000 calories, which I arrived at by cataloging every item and estimating conservatively. That was 65 days. 65 days if nothing went wrong, if I didn't spill anything, if nothing spoiled, if we didn't need extra calories for warmth as the season turned. Call it 60. September 17th. I wrote the date in my logbook and circled it, and then I stared at it for a long time, because September 17th was not a date that led anywhere good. By September 17th, the nights on Stillwater would be dropping below freezing. The first snow could come any day, and we would be out of food. But 60 days was 60 days, and I had learned from fire management that you do not fight the whole fire at once. You fight the section in front of you. You cut line. You clear fuel. You work the problem you can see, and you trust that the next problem will become visible when you reach it. So I cut line. I reorganized the food stores, separating them into daily rations stored in labeled bags. I established a schedule for June that gave her tasks: carrying water from the spring, helping with weather observations, sweeping the tower, learning to read the fire finder, because idle hands and an idle mind are dangerous at any age, and at 12, in the middle of a catastrophe, they are a gateway to a despair that I was not equipped to treat. I was not a therapist. I was not a father. I was a man who watched for fires. But I could give her structure, and structure, I had come to believe, was the closest thing to safety that existed. June did not ask about her father for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, July 22nd, she asked me if I thought he was coming. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know. I told her that the trails were long and that her father might have been delayed, that he might have found another safe place, that he might be waiting for conditions to improve before making the hike. I did not tell her what I believed, which was that David Chen was almost certainly dead. A man who sends his 12-year-old daughter up a mountain alone and promises to follow is a man who has seen something that convinces him the child's chances are better without him. He was buying her time. He was spending his life to purchase hers. I have thought about David Chen many times since then, and I believe he was a good man and a brave one, and I hope, if there is anything left of him anywhere, that he knows she made it. June accepted my answer with a nod that told me she had already arrived at the same conclusion I had, but was not yet ready to say it aloud. We did not discuss it again for many weeks. Instead, we fell into the rhythm of the tower, a rhythm that I adjusted to accommodate her presence in ways that surprised me. I had spent 11 seasons alone in that 14 by 14-foot room, and I had believed that another person in the space would feel like an intrusion, a disruption of the silence I had cultivated so carefully. It did not. June was quiet by nature, or perhaps by trauma, and she moved through the tower with a light, careful step, as though she were trying to leave no trace. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and read my copy of Marcus Aurelius, not understanding it, I'm sure, but turning the pages with the serious attention of a child who has decided that reading is what adults do in difficult situations, and therefore what she should do. She asked me questions about the firefinder, about the weather instruments, about the names of the peaks I could identify from the catwalk. I answered them all with more detail than she probably wanted, because I had discovered, after 5 days of talking to no one, that the sound of my own voice explaining something I understood was a rope I could hold on to. At night, she slept on the cot, and I slept on the floor in a nest of blankets and spare clothing. And the sounds she made in her sleep, the small cries, the sudden sharp inhalations, the whispered word that might have been "Dad," were the sounds that kept me anchored to my purpose. I was not surviving for myself anymore. I was surviving for her. The distinction matters more than you might think. A man alone on a mountain, watching the world burn, can talk himself into all sorts of conclusions. He can decide that survival is pointless. He can decide that the effort of another day is not worth the meager reward of another night. But a man with a child in his care cannot afford those conclusions. The child is eating. The child is sleeping. The child is trusting you with the whole unthinking trust of a creature that does not yet know how unreliable adults can be. You cannot let that trust go unanswered. It would be like watching a fire bearing down on a town and choosing not to pick up the radio. The last week of July brought changes that I had been dreading. The smoke in the valleys thickened to the point where my visibility dropped below 5 miles on most days, and the air quality became a genuine health concern. I tore strips from a spare bedsheet and soaked them in water for us to wear over our faces when we went outside. The spring was still flowing, but the volume had dropped noticeably. Late summer diminishment compounded by a dry period that the smoke seemed to deepen, trapping heat in the valleys and parching the upper slopes. I increased our water-carrying trips from once a day to twice, filling every container I had each time, building a reserve in case the spring failed. On July 28th, at 0740, I was scanning the lower trail when I saw movement again. This time, it was not one person, but 3. Adults, moving slowly but steadily up the switchbacks through the boulder field. I watched them through the spotting scope. 2 men and a woman. The men carried large packs. The woman carried a smaller one and walked with a limp. They were dressed in civilian clothing, not hiking gear, and one of the men was carrying what appeared to be a shotgun. They reached the base of the tower at approximately 0930. I went down to meet them with my rifle slung across my chest, and I made June stay in the tower with the trapdoor bolted shut, which was a precaution she accepted without question. The older of the two men introduced himself as Ray Fontaine. He was in his mid-50s, thick-set, with a gray beard and the calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. The younger man was his son Derek, maybe late 20s, tall and quiet, with a watchful quality that I recognized as the hypervigilance of recent trauma. The woman was Derek's wife, Carrie, and her limp was the result of a badly sprained ankle that she had wrapped in an elastic bandage that was not nearly tight enough. Ray did the talking. He told me they had driven from Marysville to the forest boundary, then hiked in when the roads became impassable. He said Marysville was gone. He said it carefully, the way you might say that a building has been demolished, a statement of fact that contains an ocean of grief beneath its surface. He said they had heard on a battery-powered radio that the mountain areas were unaffected and that people were heading for high ground. He asked if they could stay. I looked at the three of them, exhausted, frightened, carrying perhaps a week's worth of food between them. And I did the math again. 5 people now. My 216,000 calories had been diminished by 9 days of feeding 2, leaving roughly 186,000. Divided among 5 people at a conservative average of 1,700 calories per day, that was 8,500 calories per day total, which gave us 21 days. 3 weeks. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But I said yes. I said yes because they were standing in front of me, and they were human beings, and because June was watching from the tower window above, and because the alternative was to point a rifle at 3 exhausted people and tell them to walk back down into the smoke and the chaos and the death. I could not do it. I told myself that we would find a way to extend the food, that we could forage, that the forest held berries and edible plants, and that the streams might yield trout. I told myself these things with the desperation of a man constructing a budget that does not balance, and hoping that revenue will materialize from somewhere. Ray and Derek and Carrie set up camp in the meadow below the tower, using a tarp and some rope to rig a makeshift shelter against the rocks. Ray had some useful skills. He had been a contractor, and he understood structures and materials. And within 2 days, he had improved their shelter into something almost weatherproof. Derek was stronger than he looked and willing to work, and I put him on water duty, sending him to the spring 3 times a day with every container we could spare. Carrie's ankle kept her off her feet, but she took over the task of preparing meals, rationing the food with a precision that I appreciated. She had been an accountant before the outbreak, and she approached caloric management with the same methodical focus she had presumably applied to balance sheets. She calculated that if we reduced everyone to 1,200 calories per day, subsistence level, enough to function but not enough to sustain hard labor indefinitely, we could stretch our supplies to 34 days. August 31st. I did not tell them about the date I had circled in my logbook. I did not tell them that even 34 days was likely optimistic, because it assumed no further mouths to feed, and I had already begun to suspect that the Fontaines would not be the last people to find the trail. I was right. On August 1st, 2 more people appeared on the trail. A young couple, early 20s, who had hiked in from the north. They had almost nothing. A single backpack between them, a tent, no food, and the wild, disoriented look of people who had been running for days. The young man's name was Marcus, and the young woman's name was Lily. They were college students who had been on a summer backpacking trip when the world ended. I say that without irony. From their perspective, the world had ended. They had watched the town of New Halem disappear overnight, and they had walked south along the ridge trails for 4 days, eating nothing but huckleberries and stream water until they saw the tower. I fed them. I gave them a spot in the meadow near the Fontaine's shelter. And I recalculated. 7 people now. 1,200 calories each per day was 8,400 calories total. Remaining supplies, maybe 165,000 calories. 19 and a half days. August 20th. The date was accelerating toward us like a fire pushed by wind. It was Ray Fontaine who first raised the question I had been avoiding. We were standing on the catwalk on the evening of August 3rd, watching the sun go down through the brown haze that had become permanent. The smoke had closed our visibility to 4 miles, and the valleys below us were invisible. Just a sea of gray-brown murk with the occasional dark column rising through it to indicate that something, somewhere, was still burning. Ray leaned on the railing and said, without looking at me, "What happens when more people come?" I said I didn't know. "You've done the math," he said. I had. "We can't feed the mountain, Tom." I told him I knew that too. He turned and looked at me, and his face was not unkind, but it was firm in the way that the faces of men who have built things for a living tend to be firm. Practical, load-bearing, uninterested in ambiguity. "You're the ranger," he said. "This is your station. People are going to keep coming. Someone has to decide." He was right, and I hated him for being right, and I respected him for saying it. And I lay awake that night on the floor of the tower, listening to June breathe on the cot above me, and understanding that the most important decision of my life was approaching, and that there was no protocol for it, no frequency to call for guidance, no dispatch to give me coordinates. I was the only authority left on this mountain, and the mountain was becoming an island, and the island was too small. On August 5th, a group of 4 arrived. A man, his elderly mother, and 2 women who appeared to be neighbors or friends. They had driven a truck as far as the trailhead and hiked the rest. The elderly woman, whose name was Marguerite, was 78 years old and had been carried for the last 2 miles on her son's back. She was dehydrated, semi-coherent, and her feet were blistered so badly that her socks were stuck to the raw skin with dried blood. I treated her feet in the tower while June held a flashlight and handed me gauze, and the look on June's face as she watched me work, the focused, serious attention of a child who is learning that the world requires things of you that you did not expect, is one of the images I carry from that time. The son's name was Paul, and he was a large, gentle man who spoke softly and could not stop apologizing. He apologized for arriving without warning. He apologized for his mother's condition. He apologized for not having enough food. He apologized, I think, for existing, for taking up space and calories on a mountain that was already stretched to its limit. I told him to stop apologizing and to set up camp in the meadow. I did not do the math this time. I couldn't. 11 people. The number had become absurd, and the food supply had become a countdown clock that I could hear ticking in the silence between the wind gusts. Carrie Fontaine, with her accountant's mind, did the math for me. She came to the tower that evening and stood at the bottom of the stairs and called up to me in a voice that was carefully controlled. "Tom, we have enough food for 11 days at minimum rations. 15 if we cut to 900 calories a day. But at 900 calories, people can't function. They get confused. They make mistakes. 900 calories in the cold at this altitude is a slow emergency." She paused. "We need a plan." The plan, such as it was, took shape over the next 2 days. Derek and Marcus began foraging. Huckleberries were ripe on the south-facing slopes below the tree line, and there were patches of fireweed and glacier lilies that were edible, if not palatable. Ray took the fishing line and hooks from my emergency kit and hiked down to a creek 2 miles below the tower, where he managed to catch 4 small brook trout on the first day and 2 on the second. I contributed my knowledge of the edible plants in the area, which was decent if not expert. I knew that the inner bark of lodgepole pine was caloric, that certain mushrooms were safe, that the roots of biscuit root could be dug and roasted. We were not going to thrive on these additions, but they might extend our timeline by a week or 2, enough to push us into September, when I hoped, without evidence, without reason, that something would change. But the real plan, the one that Carrie and Ray and I discussed in quiet conversations on the catwalk while the others slept, was the plan for what to do when more people came. Because more people were coming. Every day I saw movement on the lower trail, sometimes figures that turned back, sometimes figures that kept climbing. On August 7th, a group of 6 reached the boulder field before turning around when one of their members collapsed from altitude sickness. On August 8th, a lone man made it within a quarter mile of the tower and then simply sat down on a rock and did not move for 3 hours until Derek went down and found him dead from what appeared to be a heart attack. We buried him in the scree field east of the tower, marking the grave with a cairn, and I said a few words that were not a prayer, because I am not a religious man, but were an acknowledgement that a human being had died trying to reach safety, and that this fact should not go unremarked. The question Ray had asked me hung over everything. Who can stay, and who must leave? I had no framework for this decision. Fire management teaches you to allocate resources based on values at risk. You protect the structures, the watersheds, the habitat. But fire management does not prepare you to look at a 78-year-old woman with blistered feet and calculate her caloric burden against her contribution. It does not prepare you to weigh the life of a college student against the life of a child. These are calculations that should never be made, and I know there are people who will read this and say that I should have simply accepted everyone, shared everything equally, and let the outcome be what it was. Those people may be better than me. They may also be people who have never counted the cans in a cabinet and divided by the number of hungry faces in the room and arrived at a number that was not enough. On August 10th, I made the first of 2 decisions that I still carry with me. A group of 9 people appeared on the trail in the early morning. They were visible from the tower for nearly an hour as they crossed the boulder field, and through the spotting scope I could see that they were in poor condition. Several were limping. One was being supported between 2 others, and they moved with the slow, mechanical determination of refugees, which is what they were. When they reached the base of the tower, I went down to meet them. They were led by a woman named Sandra, a former emergency room nurse from Concrete, Washington, who had organized a group of survivors from her neighborhood and led them east into the mountains. Her group included an elderly couple, a teenage boy, 2 middle-aged women, a man with a bandaged arm, and 2 children younger than June, a boy of about 8 and a girl of about 5. The children were not Sandra's. She had found them wandering on a forest road 2 days earlier, holding hands, silent. Sandra looked at me and said, "We have nowhere else to go." I looked at the group. 9 more people. That would bring us to 20. 20 people on a mountaintop with food for 11 days for 11 people. The math was not difficult. It was impossible. 20 people at 1,200 calories each was 24,000 calories per day. Our remaining supply, I had checked that morning, was approximately 120,000 calories. 5 days. 5 days and then nothing. I asked Sandra what supplies they had brought. She opened her pack and showed me. A first aid kit, some medications, 2 bottles of water, a bag of rice that might have held 4 cups, and a box of crackers. The others had even less. The man with the bandaged arm had a hunting knife and a fire starter, but no food at all. The elderly couple had a bag of trail mix and a can of peaches. The teenage boy had a skateboard which he had carried 9 miles up a mountain trail for reasons I chose not to question, because at 16, the things you cannot let go of are the things that tell you who you are. I stood there in the thin August air, with the wind pulling at my jacket and the smoke hazing the sun into a dull copper coin. And I looked at the 2 children, the 8-year-old boy and the 5-year-old girl, standing together with their hands linked, watching me with the patient, uncomplaining stillness of children who have learned in the space of a week that adults are unreliable, and that the only sure thing is the hand you are holding. And I knew that I could not turn them away. I could not turn any of them away. Not yet. Not with children standing in front of me. I said yes. I brought them up to the meadow, and I introduced them to the others. And I watched the faces of the people who were already there as they registered what 9 more mouths meant. Ray's face went tight. Carrie closed her eyes for a moment, and I could see her lips moving as she ran the numbers. Derek said nothing, but picked up the water containers and headed for the spring without being asked, which was his way of coping. Movement, task, the refusal to sit still with a problem he could not solve. June watched from the tower window, and when I climbed back up, she was sitting on the cot with her knees drawn to her chest and said, very quietly, "There's not enough food, is there?" "No," I said, because I had resolved from the beginning that I would not lie to her about the things that mattered. I would protect her from what I could, but I would not construct a false world for her to live in. She deserved better than that. She had walked 5 days alone through a collapsing landscape. She could handle the truth. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "I'm working on it," I said, which was not a lie, but was also not an answer. What I did was convene a meeting. That evening, after the children were put to bed in the various shelters scattered across the meadow, the adults gathered at the base of the tower in the gray-blue light of a smoky dusk. There were 13 of us. Me, Ray, Derek, Carrie, Marcus, Lily, Paul, Sandra, the 2 middle-aged women from Sandra's group whose names were Donna and Beth, the man with the bandaged arm whose name was Gil, and the elderly couple, Howard and Frances Kinnear. Marguerite, Paul's mother, was in the tower with the children, dozing in the chair by the fire finder. I stood on the lowest step of the tower stairs so that I was slightly elevated, not out of any desire for authority, but because I wanted everyone to be able to see me. And I spoke in the calm, carrying voice I had used for a decade and a half to coordinate fire crews over the radio. I told them the truth. I told them how much food we had. I told them how many calories 20 people required per day. I told them the number of days those 2 figures produced when divided. 5. I told them that foraging and fishing could extend that number, perhaps double it, but that 10 days was still 10 days, and that the wild food sources on the mountain were finite and seasonal and unreliable. I told them that the weather would begin to turn in September, that the first frost typically came to Stillwater by the 2nd week of the month, and that by October we would need not only food but fuel for warmth, and we had neither in sufficient quantity. I told them that I did not have a plan that made everyone safe, and that I would not pretend otherwise. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. 20 seconds, maybe 30, in which the only sound was the wind moving through the scree and the distant muffled roar of a fire burning somewhere in the valleys below us. Sandra spoke first. She had the directness of a person trained in triage, which is the art of deciding who you can save. "We need to send a group down," she said. "Not everyone can stay here. Some of us need to move on. Find another location, a lower elevation with better resources. A cabin, a campground, somewhere with more space and more food potential." She paused. "I'll lead them. I brought these people here, and I can take some of them somewhere else." Ray said, "Where? The valleys are full of smoke and God knows what else. You'd be walking into the same thing you walked out of." "Not necessarily," Sandra said. "The infection followed the population. It followed the roads and the towns. If we stay in the backcountry, away from the corridors, there might be empty cabins, Forest Service shelters, hunting camps with cached supplies. Tom, you know this area. What's out there?" I did know the area. I had been studying maps of it for 11 years. I told them about Sulphur Creek Cabin, a Forest Service patrol cabin 7 miles to the northeast, at about 5,000 feet, in a valley with a good creek and meadows that could support foraging. I told them about the old mining camp at Downey Creek, 12 miles to the east, which had several structures in various states of repair and was near enough to a lake that fishing was a real possibility. I told them about the abandoned fire lookout on Pew Mountain, 14 miles to the south, which was smaller than Stillwater and in worse condition, but was another defensible high point with good visibility. I spread my topographic map on the ground and showed them the routes, the elevations, the distances, the water sources, and the terrain features that would make travel difficult. The cliff bands, the river crossings, the avalanche chutes that were passable in summer but dangerous in early fall. What emerged from that conversation, over the course of 2 hours, was not so much a plan as an agreement. The group would split. 10 people would remain on Stillwater, where the tower and the existing infrastructure provided shelter, visibility, and a defensive position. 10 people would travel to the Sulphur Creek cabin and attempt to establish a second camp there. The 2 camps would remain in contact via radio. I had a spare handheld unit with a range of about 5 miles line of sight, which was not enough for the 7-mile distance to Sulphur Creek, but Ray suggested rigging a relay antenna on the ridge between the 2 points, and I thought it might work. The group heading to Sulphur Creek would take a proportional share of the food, 40%, since they would have access to better foraging at the lower elevation, and all of the fishing equipment. The group staying on Stillwater would keep the tower, the spotting scope, the main radio, and the rifle. The question of who went and who stayed was decided with less difficulty than I had expected, largely because Sandra took the lead, and because the people who volunteered to go were, for the most part, the people best equipped for the hike. Sandra herself would lead the Sulphur Creek group. Gil, despite his injured arm, insisted on going. He was a former Marine and said he'd rather be moving than sitting. Derek and Carrie volunteered, which surprised me, until Carrie explained, quietly, that her ankle was improving, and that she and Derek were young enough and strong enough to be more useful at a new camp than at an established one. Marcus and Lily went as well. They were the fittest among us, and they had already proven they could travel hard in rough country. Donna and Beth, Sandra's companions, went with her out of loyalty. The elderly couple, Howard and Francis, asked to go, which I argued against. Francis had a heart condition, and the trail to Sulphur Creek crossed 2 steep ridges. But they were insistent. Howard told me, in a private conversation, that he did not want to be a burden on the tower group, and that he would rather die on a trail than starve on a mountaintop. I could not argue with the dignity of that choice, even though I wanted to. That left 10 of us on Stillwater. Me, June, Ray, Paul, Paul's mother Marguerite, the teenage boy from Sandra's group whose name was Elijah, and the 4 children. The 2 small ones Sandra had found, whose names turned out to be Oliver and P, a nickname. Her real name was Penelope, but she had corrected me with the fierce certainty of a 5-year-old who knows exactly who she is. June made 10. I counted twice. Sandra's group left on the morning of August 12th. I gave them the map, marked with the route to Sulphur Creek and the locations of water sources along the way. I gave them 40% of the remaining food, packed in stuff sacks, along with the fishing kit, a flashlight, a lighter, a tarp, and the spare radio with fresh batteries. Sandra and I agreed on a check-in schedule, twice daily, 0800 and 1800, on a frequency we selected for its relative quiet. I stood on the catwalk and watched them descend into the tree line, 10 figures moving in a slow file through the morning light, the smoke parting around them like water around stones, and then the trees closed over them, and they were gone. The radio crackled to life at 1800 that evening. Sandra's voice, thin but clear. "Stillwater, this is Sulphur Group. We've made the first ridge. Camp for the night at the saddle. Everyone's doing okay. Carrie's ankle is holding up. Over." I acknowledged and signed off, and the relief I felt was so intense that I had to sit down on the catwalk floor and press my hands against the cold steel grating until the feeling passed. For 3 days, the check-ins continued. Sandra's group reached Sulphur Creek Cabin on the afternoon of August 14th and reported that the cabin was intact, the creek was running, and they had already identified berry patches and a meadow where they could dig roots. Derek had caught 2 trout within an hour of arrival. The relief in Sandra's voice was audible. "This is going to work, Tom," she said. "We've got a shot here." On August 15th, the 0800 check-in was on time. The 1800 check-in did not come. I waited until 1830, then called them. No response. I called at 1900, 1930, 2000. Nothing. I told myself the radio batteries might have died. I told myself they might have been busy setting up camp and lost track of time. I told myself a dozen things that were more plausible than the thing I feared, and I kept calling every 30 minutes until midnight. And then I sat in the dark tower with the handset in my lap and listened to the static and knew that something had gone wrong. The 0800 check-in on August 16th did not come either, nor the 1800. I called every hour for 2 days. On August 18th, at approximately 1400, the radio crackled and I heard Derek's voice, broken and breathless. "Stillwater. Stillwater, this is Derek. We were hit last night. They came up from the valley. We didn't hear them until they were on us. Gil is gone. Francis is gone. Howard," his voice cracked. "Howard tried to fight them with a hatchet. Sandra is hurt. We're moving. We're heading for the mining camp at Downey Creek. Do not send anyone to Sulphur Creek. It's not safe. Repeat, Sulphur Creek is not safe. Derek out." That was the last transmission I received from the Sulphur Creek group for 9 days. I will not describe what those 9 days were like, except to say that they were the period during which I came closest to despair, and that it was June who pulled me back from it. She did this not through any dramatic gesture or speech, but simply by continuing to exist, by continuing to need things from me: food, water, reassurance, instruction, the presence of an adult who was acting as though the future were a real place that could be reached. She had taken over many of the daily tasks at the tower by then. She recorded the weather observations in my logbook with handwriting that was neater than mine. She helped Oliver and P with their meals, cutting their food into small pieces, making sure they drank enough water, inventing games for them that were really survival drills disguised as play. Who can find the most berries? Who can carry the most water without spilling? Who can sit the quietest for the longest time? This last game, which she called the listening game, was not a game at all. It was practice for hiding. Because the infected, I will use that word since it is the one I heard most often on the radio, and since I never learned a better one. The infected had been seen on the lower trails. Elijah was the first to spot them. He had been foraging below the tree line, about 1,500 feet below the tower, when he came running back up the trail at a speed that told me everything before he opened his mouth. He was pale and shaking, and he said there were people on the trail. maybe half a mile below the tree line, moving uphill, and they were not moving the way hikers move. They were moving in a shuffling, relentless way, without packs, without purpose, drawn upward by something, sound, scent, instinct, that I could not identify and did not want to. I got the binoculars and scanned the tree line from the catwalk. I could not see them. The forest was too dense at that elevation. But I could see where the birds had gone silent, a zone of quiet moving slowly up the slope like the shadow of a cloud. I had seen that phenomenon before, with bears. The forest goes quiet ahead of a large predator. It is one of the oldest warning systems in nature, and it was operating now with a precision that made my stomach tighten. They never reached the tower. The terrain above the tree line, the boulder field, the scree slopes, the exposed alpine meadow, seemed to deter them. Whether they could not navigate the loose rock, or whether the open ground and the wind confused whatever senses guided them, I don't know. But I watched the zone of silence reach the tree line and stop, and then, over the course of an hour, slowly recede back down the slope. I let out a breath I had been holding for what felt like a year. From that day forward, I established a watch rotation. Ray took the 0600 to 1200 shift. I took 1200 to 1800, and Elijah, who was 16 and more capable than most adults I had known, took 1800 to midnight. From midnight to 0600, we relied on the mountain itself, the open terrain, the wind, the cold, to be our sentry. I moved the children's sleeping area from the meadow into the tower, which was cramped beyond reason with 6 people in a 14 by 14 space. Marguerite, June, Oliver, P., Elijah, and me. Ray and Paul stayed in the meadow shelter, which Ray had reinforced into something surprisingly solid. But the tower was high. It had a trapdoor that could be bolted, and it gave us the advantage of elevation, which is the most basic principle of defense, and one that humans have understood since the first watchtower was built on the first hill. On August 27th, Derek's voice came through the radio again. The relief nearly broke me. He reported that the surviving members of the Sulphur Creek group, Derek, Carrie, Sandra, Marcus, Lily, and Donna, had reached the Downey Creek mining camp and were holding there. Beth had been lost during the move from Sulphur Creek, along with Howard, Francis, and Gil, whose deaths Derek confirmed in a flat, exhausted voice that I recognized as the sound of a person who has processed grief by converting it into information. Sandra was injured, a deep laceration on her forearm that was showing signs of infection, the medical kind, which Carrie was treating with supplies from the first aid kit. They had food for about a week and were supplementing with fish from the lake. They were alive. For now. Derek asked me if we could spare any of the antibiotics from our medical kit for Sandra's arm. I checked the kit. We had a 10-day course of amoxicillin, a bottle of ibuprofen, some antibiotic ointment, and various bandages and wound care supplies. Sandra needed the amoxicillin. But Marguerite had developed a cough that was getting worse each day. A deep, rattling cough that worried me. And if it turned into a bacterial infection, the amoxicillin might be the only thing that could save her. 2 people, 1 course of antibiotics, 12 miles of dangerous trail between them. I agonized over this for a full day. I discussed it with Ray, who said, bluntly, Sandra's got a wound that could go septic. Marguerite has a cough. One of those is an emergency now, and one might become an emergency later. You send the pills to Sandra. I discussed it with Paul, who sat silently for a long time and then said, My mother would tell you to send them. She would be angry if you didn't. I discussed it with myself in the small hours of the night, lying on the floor of the tower listening to Marguerite's breathing, which had taken on a wheeze that made me think of the wind through a cracked window. In the end, I sent the amoxicillin. I asked Elijah to make the run. He was the fastest and strongest among us, and he knew the trails. I gave him the pills, a day's worth of food, a full water bottle, and precise instructions for the route to Downey Creek, including landmarks, compass bearings, and alternate paths in case the main trail was blocked. I told him to travel fast, stay above the tree line as long as possible, and avoid any sign of movement in the valleys. He left at 04:30 on August 28th, before first light, moving with the long, efficient stride of a young man who has spent the summer carrying water up a mountain. I watched him until the darkness swallowed him, and then I went back to the tower and added his name to the list of people I was afraid for. Elijah reached Downey Creek that afternoon and radioed to confirm delivery. He stayed the night and returned to Stillwater the following day, arriving at 16:20, exhausted but intact. He reported that the mining camp was rough but livable, that Sandra's arm looked bad but not catastrophic, and that the group's morale was low but functional. He also reported something that made my blood slow in my veins. On his return trip, crossing a forested saddle at about 5,500 feet, he had seen a group of the infected moving along a creek bed below him, at least 20 of them heading west. They had not detected him. He had frozen behind a fallen log and waited 45 minutes until they passed. He described them calmly, with the observational precision that I had tried to instill in him during our weeks together. And what he described was consistent with what I had heard on the radio. People who were no longer people, who moved without coordination, but with a terrible, undiscourageable persistence, who did not speak or call out, who seemed drawn to sound and movement, and whose presence in the forest was announced by the silence of every living thing around them. The month of September arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature on Stillwater by 20 degrees in a single night. I woke on September 1st to find frost on the catwalk railing and the meadow grass stiff and white. The smoke had thinned somewhat. The cold air was settling into the valleys rather than rising, which pushed the particulate layer down and gave us, for the first time in weeks, a visibility of over 20 miles. I stood on the catwalk in the early morning light and looked out over a landscape that was utterly changed from the one I had known. The valleys to the south, which in June had been an unbroken canopy of green stretching to the horizon, were now patchworked with brown and black. Burned areas, some still smoldering, others cold and dead. The towns were invisible, not because of distance, but because there was nothing left to see. No lights, no movement, no smoke from chimneys or exhaust from vehicles. The roads, where I could make them out, were static lines on the landscape, no different from the rivers except that rivers still moved. I scanned west toward the coast and saw only haze. I scanned east toward the high Cascades and saw snow on the upper peaks, the first new snow of the season, impossibly white against the gray-brown of the smoke-stained sky. I scanned north and saw forest, unbroken, stretching to the Canadian border and beyond. And I thought, not for the first time, but with a clarity that the cold air seemed to sharpen, this is what the world looks like when people stop tending it. This is the default state, green and gray and quiet, the human overlay fading like a signal losing strength until all that remains is the terrain and the weather and the slow, indifferent processes of a planet that does not notice our absence. Our food situation had stabilized, barely, through a combination of severe rationing and aggressive foraging. Ray had become an unexpectedly skilled gatherer, learning to identify and harvest the edible plants of the alpine zone with a focus and dedication that I attributed to the fact that gathering gave him something to control in a situation where almost nothing was controllable. Paul, despite his size and his gentle manner, had developed a technique for trapping pikas, the small, round-eared mammals that lived in the boulder field, using a deadfall trap constructed from flat rocks and a trigger mechanism made from sticks. The pikas were tiny, maybe 6 ounces of meat each, but protein was protein, and Paul trapped an average of 2 per day. I will admit that I felt a pang of guilt about the pikas. They were charismatic creatures, and I had spent years listening to their alarm calls as a background soundtrack to my life on the mountain. But guilt is a luxury that hunger does not accommodate, and I ate my share without complaint. June had become, in those weeks, someone I barely recognized from the exhausted, shell-shocked child who had appeared on the trail in July. She was still quiet, still careful, still prone to long silences in which she stared at the horizon with an expression that I could not read. But she had also become competent in ways that astonished me. She could identify a dozen edible plants by sight. She could start a fire with a ferro rod in under a minute. She could read the weather instruments and estimate the next day's conditions with an accuracy that rivaled my own. She had taught Oliver and P to identify the sound of the infected's movement in the forest below, a particular quality of silence that preceded them, different from the silence of a bear or a cougar, more total, as though even the insects stopped. She was, in short, adapting, and watching her adapt filled me with a complicated emotion that I think was something like pride, though it was laced with grief for the childhood she was losing with every skill she gained. It was on September 4th that I made the decision I mentioned at the beginning of this account, the decision that cost me June's trust. The morning began normally, cold, clear, visibility 23 miles. I was on the catwalk performing the sunrise scan when I saw movement on the southern trail. The same trail June had come up, the same trail the Fontaines had climbed, the same trail that had become our lifeline and our vulnerability. Through the binoculars I counted them. 14 people, spread out along the switchbacks, moving slowly upward. 14. I could see children among them, and packs, and at least 2 people being helped by others. They were refugees, another group fleeing the valleys, and they were coming here. I went inside and woke Ray. He came out onto the catwalk and looked through the binoculars and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Tom?" I said, "I know." "We can't." I said, "I know." 14 more people would bring us to 24, 10 on Stillwater, plus the 14 arriving. Our food supply, such as it was, could not absorb 14 additional people, not even close. The foraging was already stretched to its limit. Ray and Paul were covering wider and wider circles each day, going further from the tower, taking greater risks to bring back less and less. The pikas were getting harder to trap. They were learning, or we were depleting them, or both. The frost had killed many of the berry bushes. Winter was coming, and winter at 8,400 feet does not negotiate. I told Ray to stay on the catwalk and keep watching. I went down to the meadow and woke Paul and told him what was coming. Paul's face did something I had never seen it do. It hardened, the gentleness pulling back like a tide, and for a moment I saw the fear beneath it. He looked toward the tower, where his mother was sleeping, and then he looked at me, and he said, "What do you need me to do?" I told him I needed him to stay with the children and with Marguerite. I told him that I was going to meet the group on the trail and that I was going to tell them they could not stay. I will not pretend this was purely a rational decision. It was also a cowardly one, in the sense that I made it quickly because I was afraid that if I deliberated, I would not be able to make it at all. The mathematics were clear. The morality was not. I was about to walk down a trail and tell 14 exhausted, frightened human beings, including children, that there was no room for them on this mountain, that they would have to keep going, that the safety they had been climbing toward for days did not exist, at least not for them. I was going to do this because the 8 people behind me, the 8 people I had already accepted responsibility for, would die if I did not. And I had decided, without fully articulating it to myself, that the people I could see mattered more than the people I had not yet met. I picked up the rifle. Not to threaten. I want to be clear about this. but because the trail passed through the tree line, and the tree line was no longer safe. I started down the trail at 07:15. I met the group at approximately 0800, about 3/4 of a mile below the tower, just above where the trail entered the boulder field. They were spread out along the trail in a ragged line, sitting on rocks, leaning against boulders, breathing hard. A man at the front stood up when he saw me. He was maybe 40, lean and weathered, with a hunting rifle of his own slung over one shoulder. He looked at me, and then at my rifle, and then at the tower above us, and I saw the hope in his face. The terrible, luminous hope of a person who has been walking toward a fixed point for days and has finally reached it. And what I was about to do to that hope is the thing I carry. I introduced myself. I told him I was the ranger stationed at the tower. I told him, as gently and as clearly as I could, that the tower was already at capacity, that our food supply could not support additional people, and that I could not take his group in. I watched the hope die in his face the way a fire dies when the wind shifts and the oxygen is cut off. Not slowly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that is worse than any explosion. His name was Martin, and he was a high school shop teacher from Concrete, and the people behind him were his neighbors and their families, and they had been walking for 6 days, and 2 of them had died on the trail, and one of the children had a fever. He listened to everything I said, and then he said, "Where do we go?" I told him about the Downey Creek mining camp. I told him the route, 12 miles east, crossing 2 ridges, following the creek drainage. I told him there was a group already there, that they had shelter and water and some food, and that they might be able to absorb his group if they shared the foraging range. I drew him a map on a piece of paper torn from my logbook. I gave him compass bearings and landmarks, and warned him about the creek crossings that would be difficult with children. I gave him what I could, which was information, the only resource I had that did not diminish when shared. Martin took the map and folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He did not argue. He did not plead. He looked at me with an expression that I have tried many times to name and cannot, because it was too complex for a single word. It contained understanding and resentment and exhaustion, and something that might have been respect for the ugliness of the choice I had made. He said, "You're making the right call. I don't like you for it, but you're making the right call." Then he turned around and walked back to his group, and I heard him say, in a voice that was steady and kind, "Okay, folks, change of plans. We're heading east." I stood on the trail and watched them go. 14 people turning away from the mountain they had pinned their survival on, reshuffling their packs and their hopes and their aching feet for 12 more miles of trail through dangerous country. And I thought about the man with the bandaged arm, and the old couple, and the 5-year-old girl named P, whose real name was Penelope. And I told myself that I had chosen them, that by turning Martin away, I was keeping my promise to the people who were already in my care, and that this was the correct and defensible thing to have done. I told myself this all the way back up the trail. I was still telling myself when I reached the tower. June was on the catwalk. She had been watching through the binoculars. She had seen everything. "You sent them away," she said. "Yes." "There were kids." "Yes." She looked at me, and her eyes, dark and serious and too old for 12, held the expression I described at the beginning of this account. Betrayal. The foundational shock of discovering that the person you depend on is capable of making a choice that you cannot understand. A choice that seems to violate the basic terms of the agreement between protector and protected. I had promised her safety. She had interpreted that promise broadly, as children do, to mean that I was the kind of person who kept everyone safe. And I had just demonstrated, in front of her, that I was not. That I was a person who counted and calculated and drew lines, and that the lines I drew left people on the wrong side. She did not speak to me for 3 days. 3 days of silence in a 14 by 14-foot room, which is an eternity when the person not speaking to you is the person whose trust is the organizing principle of your existence. She was not rude. She continued to do her tasks, the weather observations, the water runs, the care of the younger children. She simply would not look at me, or address me, or respond when I spoke to her. She treated me as though I were a piece of furniture, functional but without interiority. And the precision of this punishment was, I must admit, impressive. On the third evening, I sat down next to her on the catwalk. The sun was going down in a haze of amber and gray. The valleys were invisible, filled with smoke and shadow, and the mountain peaks to the east were catching the last light on their snow-covered summits, glowing like lanterns in a dark room. I said, "June, I want to explain why I did what I did, and I want you to listen, and then you can decide what you think of me." She did not respond, but she did not leave, which I took as permission. I told her the truth. I told her about the food supply, the numbers, the arithmetic that governed our survival. I told her that 14 more people would have meant starvation for everyone, including Oliver and P, including Marguerite, including her. I told her that I had not wanted to turn them away, that the decision had cost me something I would never recover, and that I understood if she could not forgive me for it. I told her that I had sent them to a place where they might survive, that I had given them the best information I had, and that I would carry the weight of not knowing whether it was enough for the rest of my life. She listened to all of it without expression. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, watching the light fade on the distant peaks. Then she said, "My dad sent me away too. He said it was to keep me safe." A pause. He was right, but I still wish he hadn't. I understood then that she was not really talking about Martin's group. She was talking about the central wound of her life, which was that the person she loved most had made a decision that saved her and destroyed her in the same gesture, and that she would spend years, maybe a lifetime, trying to reconcile those two things. I was not her father, but I was the closest thing she had, and she needed me to be better than the mathematics of survival, and I had shown her that I was not. "I'm sorry," I said. She leaned against my shoulder, just slightly, a pressure so light I might have imagined it. "I know," she said. That was the forgiveness. Insufficient, imperfect, the kind of forgiveness that a child offers because the alternative is a loneliness too vast to endure. I took it, and I was grateful for it, and I have tried every day since to deserve it. September passed in a slow contraction. The days grew shorter. The frost came every night now, and by mid-month there was a skim of ice on the water containers each morning that had to be broken with a knuckle before we could drink. The foraging dwindled as the alpine plants died back. The berries were gone, the fireweed was gone, the lilies were gone. Only the roots persisted, and digging them from the frozen ground required more calories than they provided. Paul's pica traps still produced, but the catch had dropped to 1 every other day, barely enough protein to matter. We ate our ration, 900 calories per day now, supplemented by whatever the mountain gave us. And we grew thinner, and we moved more slowly, and the silences between us lengthened as our bodies began to conserve energy for the essentials: warmth, breath, the mechanical processing of food into fuel. The radio was my window onto a world I could no longer see. The smoke had returned with the autumn inversions, thick layers of cold, particulate-laden air that settled into the valleys and reduced my visibility to 3 miles on most days. I could no longer see the towns. I could no longer see the fires. I could only see the immediate surroundings: the meadow, the boulder field, the tree line, and the sky, which had taken on a permanent grayish-yellow tint that made noon look like dusk and dusk look like the end of everything. But the radio told me things. The military frequencies, which had been busy with tactical traffic in July and August, had gone almost silent. The emergency broadcast loop had stopped on September 9th, mid-sentence, and had not resumed. The amateur radio operators, the ham radio enthusiasts who are always the last civilian communicators standing in any disaster, were still active, and I monitored their conversations with the desperate attentiveness of a man reading letters from the front. From them, I learned that the outbreak had spread across the entire continental United States, that the major cities were abandoned or destroyed, that the federal government had relocated to an underground facility whose location was the subject of constant speculation, and that scattered groups of survivors were establishing enclaves in remote areas: islands, mountaintops, desert compounds, offshore platforms. I learned that the infected could not swim, which explained why the coastal islands were doing relatively well. I learned that they were slowed by cold but not stopped by it, which meant that winter would help but not save us. I learned that someone in Colorado had discovered that the infected were attracted to sound and repelled by fire, which confirmed what I had already observed from the tower. And I learned, in a transmission that I heard on September 22nd from an amateur operator in British Columbia, that a network of survivor communities was forming along the Canadian border, linked by radio and by trail, and that they were actively seeking contact with any surviving groups in the North Cascades. That transmission changed everything. I responded immediately, identifying myself, my location, and the number of people in my group. The operator, whose call sign was VE7BXC and whose name was Robert, asked me a series of questions. How many in my group? What was our food situation? Did we have medical needs? Could we travel? I answered honestly. 8 people on Stillwater, 6 at Downey Creek. Food for maybe 3 weeks. Medical needs moderate. Ability to travel limited by children and an elderly woman. Robert told me that a community had established itself at Ross Lake, about 35 miles to the north-northeast, in the old hydroelectric facility on the dam. They had power. They had food stores from the facility's emergency supplies. They had defenses. The dam itself was a natural choke point, and the lake behind it was a moat. They were accepting survivors. He gave me a frequency for direct contact and a name. Ask for Catherine. I contacted Catherine that evening. She was brisk, efficient, and cautious. She asked me the same questions Robert had asked, plus several more. Had anyone in my group been bitten or scratched? Did we have any weapons? Did we have skills that would be useful to a community? Medical training, construction experience, mechanical ability, agricultural knowledge. I answered her questions and added that I had 11 years of wilderness experience, knowledge of every trail and drainage in the North Cascades, a fire lookout tower with a 360-degree view of the surrounding terrain, and a 12-year-old girl who could read weather instruments and identify edible plants. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you make it here?" 35 miles. Through mountain terrain, in early autumn, with an elderly woman who could barely walk, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 12-year-old. Past the tree line where the infected moved, through valleys choked with smoke and shadow. 35 miles. We can try, I said. The preparation took a week. I radioed Derek at Downey Creek and told him the plan. He was skeptical at first. The mining camp was farther from Ross Lake than Stillwater was, and his group would have to cross more difficult terrain. But Sandra, whose arm had healed enough for her to resume leadership of the Downey Creek group, came on the radio and said, "We're coming. If there's a place with power and food and walls, we're coming." We agreed to rendezvous at a point on the Skagit River Trail, about 18 miles from Stillwater and 22 from Downey Creek, on October 3rd. I spent the days before departure packing what we could carry. The remaining food divided into individual daily rations. The water bottles and purification tablets. The medical kit, diminished but still useful. The radio and its batteries. The binoculars. The spotting scope. The rifle and the remaining ammunition, which I counted, 31 rounds. I packed the map, my logbook, and the photograph of my mother. I left everything else: the firefinder, the weather instruments, the cot, the stove, the propane, the books, the 11 years of notes and observations that I had recorded in previous seasons. I left them not because they didn't matter, but because they were too heavy, and because the tower would stand whether I was in it or not. And someone, someday, might climb the trail and find them useful. On the evening of October 1st, the night before we left, I climbed the tower one last time. I stood on the catwalk in the cold, dark air and looked out at the world I had watched for 11 years. The visibility was poor, maybe 6 miles, and the only light was the stars, fierce and close above me, and a faint orange glow to the south that might have been a fire or might have been my imagination. The mountain was silent. The wind had died. Even the pikas were quiet, bedded down in their rock burrows for the night, waiting for a dawn that they, at least, could trust to arrive on schedule. I thought about what this mountain had been to me. It had been a home, a workplace, an observatory, a fortress, and a prison. It had given me a perspective, literally a view, that had allowed me to see what was happening in the world below at a time when most people could only see what was happening in their immediate vicinity. That perspective had been a gift and a curse. I had seen too much and been able to do too little. I had watched cities go dark and fires advance and highways empty and a civilization dim, and I had recorded it all with the meticulousness of a man who believed that seeing clearly was the same as understanding. It is not. I understood almost nothing. I still don't. The outbreak, its origin, its mechanism, its trajectory, remains as opaque to me now as it was on the night I first saw the anomalous glow over Darrington. What I understand is smaller and more personal. That a man alone on a mountain is not safe, only isolated. That safety is a function of community, not geography. That the decisions you make about who to help and who to turn away are the decisions that define you, not the ones you make about yourself. And that a 12-year-old girl with a red baseball cap and her father's courage taught me more about endurance than 11 years of watching fires ever did. We left at 0500 on October 2nd. The descent was slow. Marguerite could walk, but only with Paul on one side and Ray on the other, and their pace set ours. About 1 mile per hour on the downhill sections, slower on the flat, and agonizingly slow on the uphills. June carried P on her back for the first 3 miles, until the little girl insisted on walking, and then June walked beside her and held her hand and matched her small steps with a patience that made my chest ache. Oliver walked on his own, silent and determined, his eyes scanning the tree line with the practiced alertness of a child who has learned to watch for danger. Elijah ranged ahead, scouting the trail, checking sight lines, signaling back with hand gestures we had established during our weeks on the mountain. I brought up the rear with the rifle, watching the forest behind us, listening for the silence that meant we were not alone. We made the tree line by noon. The transition from the open alpine into the dense forest was like entering a room after standing in a field. The light dimmed, the wind dropped, the sound changed. Every footstep was amplified. Every branch that snapped under a boot sent a jolt through my nervous system. We moved through the forest in a tight group, no one more than 10 feet from anyone else, speaking only in whispers when we spoke at all. The trail was overgrown in places. No one had maintained it since July, and twice we had to detour around fallen trees that blocked the path. At 14:30, we reached a creek crossing that had been a simple rock hop in June but was now a knee-deep ford, the water swollen by autumn rains. Ray and I carried the children across. Marguerite waded with Paul's help, gasping at the cold. On the far side, we rested for 20 minutes, and I checked the map and estimated that we had covered 7 miles. That night we camped in a dense stand of old-growth cedar, the trees so massive and close together that they formed a natural enclosure. I did not allow a fire. The light and smoke would attract attention, both human and otherwise. We ate our cold rations in the dark and slept in shifts, 2 people awake at all times, and the sounds of the forest at night. The creak of branches, the rustle of small animals, the distant, ambiguous noises that could have been anything, kept my heart rate elevated for the entire 6 hours I lay on the ground pretending to rest. The second day was harder. The trail climbed over a ridge at 6,200 feet and then descended steeply into a valley where the smoke was thick and the visibility was less than a quarter mile. We were essentially blind, navigating by compass and by the feel of the trail under our feet. Marguerite fell twice on the descent, and the second time she did not get up immediately, and Paul knelt beside her, and I saw his face, and I knew he was calculating the same thing I was. She could not do 35 miles. She might not be able to do 20. The spirit was there. Marguerite had a will that I envied, but the body was 78 years old and had been surviving on 900 calories a day for weeks, and it was failing. We made the rendezvous point on the Skagit River Trail at 1640 on October 3rd, half a day behind schedule. Sandra's group was already there. The reunion was quiet. Too much exhaustion and too much loss for celebration. But there were embraces, and I saw Derek's face when he saw us, and the relief in it was the most human thing I had witnessed in months. Sandra looked thin but strong, her wounded arm still bandaged but functional. Marcus and Lily were leaner and harder than I remembered, their college student softness burned away by 2 months of survival. Donna was there, quiet, steady, carrying a pack that was nearly as big as she was. Carrie moved immediately to Marguerite and began checking her vitals with a competence that told me she had been learning from Sandra. We were 14 now. 14 people, maybe 17 miles from Ross Lake, with food for 3 days and a landscape between us that was unknown and dangerous. But we were together. And there is a strength in numbers that transcends the arithmetic of calories and carrying capacity. We set out the next morning. I will not recount the entire journey to Ross Lake. It took 4 days, not 3, because of Marguerite and because of 2 detours we were forced to make when Elijah, scouting ahead, reported infected in the trail corridor. The detours cost us miles and elevation and time. And by the 3rd day, we were out of food and moving on water and will alone. Oliver stopped speaking on the 2nd day and did not start again until we reached the dam. P developed a cough that terrified me. I thought of Marguerite's cough, of the amoxicillin I had sent away, of all the small medical crises that could become lethal in the absence of infrastructure. June walked beside me for most of the 3rd day. And at one point she said, very quietly, "Tom, I don't think Marguerite can make it." And I said, "She'll make it." And June looked at me with an expression that said she knew I was lying, but appreciated the effort. Marguerite made it. She made it because Paul carried her for the last 6 miles, all 112 pounds of her, on his back, up a trail that climbed 800 feet to the dam road. And he did this without complaint, and without stopping, and without any indication that it was remarkable, because it was his mother, and that was the end of the discussion. We reached Ross Lake Dam at 11:15 on October 7th. The dam was a concrete structure spanning a narrow gorge, with the lake behind it stretching north into the mountains, dark green and cold and very still. On the far side of the dam, we could see structures, buildings, tents, a communications antenna, movement, human movement, organized, purposeful, the movement of people who had tasks and schedules and reasons to walk from one place to another. A woman came out onto the dam to meet us. She was tall, middle-aged, with short gray hair and a radio clipped to her belt. She said, "I'm Catherine. We've been expecting you. How many?" 14, I said. She counted us, her eyes moving down the line, pausing on the children, pausing on Marguerite in Paul's arms, pausing on the rifle on my shoulder. Then she nodded and said, "Come in. We have food ready." I want to tell you that I felt joy in that moment, but what I actually felt was a loosening, a release of tension so total that my legs nearly buckled. I had been holding everything, the fear, the calculations, the weight of 8 lives and then 14, in a clenched place inside my chest for 87 days. And in the moment that Catherine said, "Come in," the clench released, and I was just a tired man standing on a dam with a group of people he had somehow kept alive. We stayed at Ross Lake. We are still here as I write this, though the community has grown and changed in ways I could not have predicted. I am no longer a fire lookout ranger. There is no Forest Service to employ me, no dispatch to call, no schedule of observations to keep. But I am a watcher still. Catherine, who turned out to be a former county emergency manager with an organizational mind that I can only describe as architectural, appointed me to the observation team, and I spend my days on the ridgeline above the dam with binoculars and a radio, scanning the forest and the lake and the trails for movement, for danger, for the approach of survivors or threats. It is not so different from what I did before. The view is different. The stakes are the same. June is 14 now. She is taller than she was, and quieter in a way that is no longer the silence of trauma, but the silence of someone who is thinking carefully before she speaks. She helps in the community garden and assists Sandra, who survived, who thrived, who became the closest thing Ross Lake has to a chief medical officer, in the clinic. She still reads Marcus Aurelius, and I think she understands more of it now than she did on the mountain. She does not call me Dad. She calls me Tom. But there is something in the way she says it that carries the weight of what we went through together. A weight that does not need a different word to be understood. Marguerite passed away in November, quietly, in her sleep, in a warm room with Paul beside her. She was comfortable, and she was not afraid. Paul buried her on the hillside above the lake, in a spot where the morning sun hits first, and he visits the grave every day. Ray built a bench there, because that is what Ray does. He builds things, solid things, things that will outlast the crisis and the grief and the long, slow work of rebuilding. Martin's group, the 14 people I turned away from Stillwater, reached Downey Creek, and from there, eventually, Ross Lake. I know this because Martin found me, 3 weeks after we arrived, and stood in front of me and said, "You were right, and I still don't like you for it." Then he shook my hand. We are not friends, but we are neighbors, which in this new world may matter more. I go back to Stillwater sometimes, in my mind. I close my eyes and I am on the catwalk, 8,400 feet above sea level, with the firefinder at my back and the whole burning world spread out before me. And I am the last ranger watching the fires, and the fires are everywhere, and the radio is silent, and the only thing I can do is what I have always done. See clearly, record what I see, and trust that the act of witnessing has value even when it changes nothing. I think about the moment the lights went out in the towns below, one by one, like a hand moving across a switchboard. And I think about how it looked from above. Not like catastrophe, not like the end of everything, but like the earth simply taking a breath, pulling the human noise into itself and holding it, the way the forest holds the sound of a falling tree long after the tree has settled. The world changed. It is still changing. From a mountain, you can see the change for what it is. Not an ending, but a turning. A vast and terrible turning, in which everything that was built is tested against everything that endures. And the things that endure are the things that were always there. The rock, the water, the wind, the stubborn, implausible persistence of life in all its forms, including the form that stands on a catwalk with binoculars and a logbook and a promise to keep watching, no matter what the watching reveals. I made a promise to a 12-year-old girl that I would keep her safe. For 41 days I kept it, and on the 42nd day I broke it. And in the breaking, I learned that safety is not a place, or a wall, or a locked trapdoor. It is a decision, made again and again, in the face of evidence that it cannot be kept, to try anyway. The mountain taught me that. The mountain, and a girl with a red baseball cap, and the fires that burned below us while we watched, together, from the last high place.